Hey everyone, so we're going to go ahead and get started here. I just want to let you know that this is being recorded, so please mute your mics and turn off your cameras. If you have a question, please type it in the chat and we will get to those at the end. So today we are talking about Texas as a swing state, what that means and what that looks like. So I want to go ahead and introduce all of our presenters today. My name is Misty Wilson-Mertens. I am the Chair of Social Sciences, and we also have with us Angela Thurman.
Good morning. I'm Angela Thurman. I'm the Chair of Economics and Sciences, and I'm also an economics instructor.
And we also have Kimberly Cox.
Hi, I'm Kimberly Cox. I'm a instructor of government.
And we have our Halloween pictures up here since we're not really getting to celebrate this year.
I don't like scary things. I gotta say, Halloween's my least favorite holiday. I hate to say that, but so that's why I went with wholesome instead of scary.
All right, so the first thing we want to talk about today is that all of this information is time sensitive. Professor Cox, you want to take this?
Sure, I'll take it. And I think this is so true this election cycle. Looking at the data, it has been changing so fast. I started kind of putting together just for this presentation the data around the 1st of October, and just from that time to now I've had to switch things up, if that makes sense. So if you look at the numbers, this is from 538, I believe, and you dig into these numbers, as of June 1st of 2020, looking at 538, Trump was favored 30 and 100 to Biden 70 and 100. That's nationwide, looking at their data. On August 1st, it was 29 and 100 to Trump to Biden 71 and 100. And around October 6th, something starts to happen to those numbers. They start to move a little bit more significantly. And as of today, I did look at it. Trump is 12 and 100 odds to win, and Biden 88 and 100. So there's been a significant jump, I think, in the last few months, and it just keeps changing and wiggling back and forth. And the electoral vote prediction, looking at the different sites I've looked at, I looked at Sabato's Crystal Ball, 538, 270 to win, and some various other ones. It's really interesting because if you look at 270 to win, it's 290, Biden to 163 on the Electoral College. But if you go to 538 and Sabato are exactly the same. They are 344 electoral votes to 194 to Trump. And it's questions like this. I'm going, well, what is causing these shifts? Some say the debate, some say COVID. I think what we'll have to do on our next presentation is dig through these numbers and see if there's any data as to what actually caused the shifts. And as a side note in this too, even if you look at, we're looking at a presidential slide for data, but if you look at state races like the Cornyn Hager Texas Senate race, that race too has shifted. In mid-October, Cornyn was up by 8 points, but now if you look at 538, there's like a spread of 2 to 7 points, which is a significant difference in the spread when you look at that from just a few weeks difference. So I think that we're going to basically, I think we're going to have to keep looking at all these polls on a daily basis to see what's going to happen. I think things are going to be really close. I think election night's going to be super exciting for those that like this, or scary for some. And I want to just mention really quick, when it's a close race, it becomes harder to predict. And so I think pollsters this year are being really, really careful, and they're looking at a lot of state data, and they're looking at more factors in that data. And it's really, really hard for pollsters to anytime to predict when the races are single digit gaps versus double digit gaps. So if you see candidates that are ahead, like by say 12, 15%, those are a little more solid guesses. If they're single digit, like a 5%, 3%, then it's going to be a harder call to make, if that makes sense.
So, Kim, I've got a question for you. How accurate do you think these polls are? I know that in the last presidential election, the Trump win was not really predicted, and everyone was really surprised. So, Misty and I have done a lot of webinars on fake news and things being reported that are slanting to one side or another. So, do you think that polls can fall into that category as well?
I think so. And one reason I look at 538 is they do a poll of polls where they rate polls. So theirs is really data driven for the most part. I mean, Sabato's Cristobal and Inside Elections also will give you a lot of their background. In 2016, I think what happened is it was one of those single digit races at the presidential level where you had well, I talked about, if you're double digits, it's really easy to predict. If you're single digits, it's not so easy. But I also think that people focused on the popular vote versus the electoral college vote. Because if you go back at 2016 and you look at the data on the popular vote, most polls were pretty close. It was the electoral college where they were having a harder time. And so they were looking at some of the state polling, which is always less accurate, I'll be honest. And the factors that were used for some of the state polling were not as robust. They didn't use as many factors to kind of look at demographics, education, registration, all that stuff. And so what some of these bigger polls like 538, Sabato's and all that have done this year is they're looking at a lot more factors at the state level and kind of accounting for what some of the problems were in the 2016 polling. So we'll see if it works. They're trying to make it better. That's the best answer I can give on that.
All right, thank you very much. So, has Texas always been a one-party state? Have we always been? And maybe you could take this, answer this. Go ahead and explain to everyone what is blue, what is red.
So, Texas traditionally has been a one-party state, kind of. So I put some key moments here up from Texas history. This first man who was in sort of the flannel vest, that is Sam Houston, one of the founders of our nation/state. Sam Houston is very much a product of the South. He's the former governor of Tennessee. He fought in the War of 1812 with Andrew Jackson. Again, very much a product of the South. He's a representative of Texas being that kind of southern bloc. And so for most of our history, we had a one-party vote. Early in our history, it's the Democratic vote, which is what we're going to see happening in the late 1800s, early 1900s, except for a brief period of Reconstruction. And then I have for you guys a picture of LBJ, the one who is yelling, and John F. Kennedy, who are campaigning together in 1960. So what's interesting about this to me is that Kennedy and Johnson represent this very uneasy coalition that the Democratic Party had developed. Kennedy is a progressive from New England. Johnson is considered a Southern, moderate to conservative Democrat. And yet here are these two men campaigning for president and vice president together. And just as a side note, I love these two men's faces. If you yell at Johnson, he's going to yell back at you. And Kennedy just looks so put out. This is not the first time Kennedy has had to reel Johnson back in. When Johnson takes over as president, he's going to sign the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. And we'd already seen a political shift happening where the southern states are moving away from the Democratic Party and towards the Republican Party, but that's going to accelerate that shift. Fast forward to the 1990s, and this is Governor Ann Richards. So Ann Richards and George W. Bush, who's the governor that follows her, really represent the end of that shift. Since Ann Richards, we've not had another Democratic governor in Texas. George Bush really ushers in this era of new conservatism or compassionate conservatism. And interesting enough, it's his presidential election in 2000 that actually has us start using the terms red and blue. So those are not terms that have been a long part of our political history. It was just the two colors they got assigned in the 2000 election, and we stuck with it. So red is going to be the Republican Party and blue is going to be the Democratic Party.
Okay. That makes sense. So what about in the modern era? I mean, so everyone always says that Texas is red. Texas is a one-party state. Is that true today?
It depends on what you're really asking. So the first chart we have up here is all of the modern presidential votes. And so you can see the last time that Texas as a state voted for a Democrat is going to be Jimmy Carter. But I want you guys to remember that Jimmy Carter is also a man of the South. He's from Georgia. He's a farmer. He's an evangelical. He really represents a lot of what that Southern bloc wanted in a president. And when Texas went for him, you can see it's not like it was a strong victory. We barely went for Carter. And then in 1980 and 1984, you're going to see that reverse and lean very hard into Reagan. And then since then, we've had a pretty solid Republican vote on the presidential level. If you look at the second chart that's up here, this just shows you over time the change that we've seen. And so even today, when we talk about Texas being a quote unquote red state, and we'll talk about this more later, there are pockets of blue. We're not a unified state, and probably some of that is just because we're so big. If we were the size of Connecticut, this probably wouldn't be true.
Yeah, and I think too, when you look at the growth, you had 100 years of Democratic control, and the Republicans, basically they're working at it the whole time as well. So the growth of the Republican Party has been really slow, and it was a top-down approach where you had, first you had conservative Democrats during that 100-year control period voting for Republican presidential candidates, and then Republican congressional candidates, and a Republican governor when we get to Bill Clements. And so the picture on the slide, the slides, I think the right side where the two Texas pictures are, shows how those shifts can be quite dramatic. If you were to slide kind of in the middle there, the Reagan Texas, you'd see a huge swath of red as well. And I'm going to put in the chat, there's Ken Burns did a series on elections during times of crisis, and he kind of argues that in this modern era, we may be in one of those times of crisis with COVID, for example. I'm not sure I buy all that, but it's a really good site that basically goes through these big shifts like we see on the slide there as well. And I think where we are now is that Republicans have dominated for the last 25 years, but we've had a lot of demographic shifts and other shifts that are happening. And the Democrats over the last 10 years in particular have been running a grassroots level campaign where they're really, really looking at, okay, let's put people in at the lower level and build up. So what we're seeing now has been years of work by the Democratic Party. And so I think we're seeing one of those shifts where people may be reevaluating the role of government in their lives and what they want, and therefore the parties are going to have to respond as well. And I think that the Republican Party for the last 20, 25 years has not really had to work that hard for Texas. They've had a lot of seats that run unopposed. They haven't had to put a lot of funding into the state. And all of a sudden the Democrats are coming in with this grassroots campaign over these last 10 years, and they're really challenging the Republican Party. So I think that regardless of what happens at this cycle, the next cycle, Republicans will kind of come in and say, okay, we need to at minimum reevaluate how we run our campaigns and how we compete for these seats in Texas to stay as aggressive and competitive as they have.
All right, good to know. So explain Texas voter turnout.
Okay, so this one's interesting as far as participation. If you look at the historical voting data within Texas, it's understandable that political science see a traditional one-party state. We shift from Democrat to then Republican control. But a lot of people argue that we're not a one-party state, we're a low participation state, that just a lot of people don't show up and vote, and if they did, we'd be more in the purple area, or at least more pinkish, if that makes sense. So Texas Lyceum did a poll, and 61% of the people that were asked said significant changes were needed, though, to make the electoral system work for a lot of Texans that don't turn out and vote. When they looked at, they said voter turnout is the reason that we are so red. And they looked at who votes. So if you look at some of the data in 2016, only 48% of Texans aged 18 to 24 were registered to vote, compared to 78% of older Texans. So you have, the huge percentage gap between, where basically youth voting and older voting is. And so for education attainment, they looked at that number too, and only 32% of Texans without a high school diploma voted in 2016, compared to 74% of those with a bachelor's degree. And when you look at the demographics too, most Republican voters are older and most Democratic voters are younger. So every day the demographics and the voting patterns are going to be changing, if that makes sense. The other thing they looked at is voting eligible population, VEP, if you ever see that on some of the Secretary of State's data or polling. And what they looked at is in the 2016 presidential election, Texans cast nearly 8.97 million votes for the highest office, but it only represented over half, 51.4% of the voting eligible population, which is interesting. So I think there are many that argue it's about turnout, and that if more people voted, the races would be more competitive.
Let me ask you this. Does voter turnout vary across the state? Like, is it, okay, well, here you go.
Yes, it does. And I know that I'll skip to that one because I'll go back. Before I talk about voter turnout, we'll look at the overall type of election really quick, and then I'll talk about this one because I think it's really interesting on if you look at the type of election, yes, it matters, as well as throughout the state. So for presidential elections, if we just look overall throughout the whole state of Texas, turnout in 2016 was 59%. 2012 it was 58%. So and then 2008 I looked at too is 59. So you were talking 59, 58, 59. That's not a huge shift overall. The percentages are staying really, really close on presidential years. In primary election years, if you look at 2018, you had let's see, Republicans were at 12%, Democrats were at 12.9, Republicans 12.4. And then if you look at 2016, Republicans were at 19%, Democrats were at 10. So in the primary election for 2018 and 2016, you do see differences in who votes, which I think is really strange because not that many people show up in primary elections versus presidential. And then we get to the midterm. The midterm in 2018 was the 6th largest jump in ballots cast in the U.S., and that's according to the Texas Tribune. But still, even with the 6th largest jump in ballots cast, it was only 53% of the voter turnout, people turned out to vote. And we ranked in the bottom in 10 of the U.S. states for turnout. So when we're looking at turnout numbers, we don't turn out and vote very much. So what happens when we get to throughout Texas? Which counties are among the highest? It does matter. Right now, Harris, Fort Bend, Travis, and I looked today, Denton and Collin County and up in like North Dallas area are off the charts in their voting compared to what they normally do. So I think too, it's one thing about Texas is that you have these, again, pockets where you have these urban areas that vote or lean more Democrat. And then if you look at the last election cycle for 2016, you have the Panhandle, West Texas, and East Texas that went heavily Republican. And there's a lot of people living in those areas. So they kind of almost, so I said, maybe we're more purple. It balances us out.
Well, how does Tarrant County compare?
Now, Tarrant County, oops, let me get to that one. Tarrant County, what I had to look at on this one is, or what I did look at on this one was looking at current voter turnout. So I looked at compared to the rest of the state, the first day of early voting was one of those numbers I wanted to look at. And in Tarrant County, we were at a little over 42,000 votes. At 2016, we're at 43,000 was the highest count of a daily vote. So I think that Tarrant County in particular, if you look at us compared to Harris County or some of these other counties that are just off the charts, we are not voting as much. So I think that that's, possibly an issue here. I'm not sure if and Tarrant County's been typically one of the red pockets that changed a little bit in 2018 or shifted a little bit, but you have a lot of people that vote very much along the Republican Party line, and I don't know if it's because of lack of competition or because even this year, if you look at like my ballot, what I looked at, Kay Granger is favored to win. She raised over $2 million, and Welch, the Democratic candidate, 65,000 at the time. Or if you look at Jane Nelson, she way outraised Zatoun, and then you have Charlie Guerin, who's running unopposed. So the likelihood of the Republican candidates where I live winning is really, really high. And I don't know if that factors into why people don't get out and vote in Tarrant County. And I don't know what you, Misty, think on that one.
So I think Tarrant County is super interesting. I read a lot of national news and on national blogs about voting, and we are in the top 5 counties that people are watching nationally, because Tarrant County is just this real weird place. Yes, we generally, for big elections, go Republican, but not too long ago, we had Wendy Davis as one of our representatives. So Tarrant County has shown itself to be a somewhat flexible county. We shift. So I would say Tarrant County is probably not red, probably not blue, but maybe maroon, kind of purpley.
Oh, maroon, because I'm an Aggie, so maroon is a good color. So tell me, what demographic shifts are affecting this? And I also think we might want to go back and look at, I had noticed the border counties in the last election went blue. So would you consider that a demographic shift that affects the voter turnout? Or are you looking more at, when you say demographics, are you meaning more education? So if you could explain that to me.
So I'm going to jump in right before you, Kim.
Sure, go ahead.
When we were first putting this webinar together over the summer, and our idea of Texas being a swing state, it was almost like kind of in quotation marks swing state, because there were a lot of pundits putting up headlines like this. These are all from this past 3 months. Can Texas go blue? Will Texas go blue? Texas will never go blue. One of these, the one that says Texas will be turning blue any second now, that's actually an article about how that's never going to happen. So this is a conversation on the national level, what's happening to Texas. And the reason for that is Professor Thurman and I did a webinar last spring about the census and about changes in Texas. And one of the reasons everyone is focusing on Texas is because we've had so much growth. We have grown in leaps and bounds in the last 40 years. So we're getting immigrants, as in immigrants from another country, but also domestic immigrants, like from California and New York and New Jersey. We are seeing a population shift in who votes. We are seeing more educated Texans getting degrees, moving into some college education of some sort. All of that is going to change what Texas looks like. We're not just going to stay stagnant if we're seeing all of this shifting.
Right. Okay.
And then this is what the demographic shifts look like overall. So the more orange it is, the more it has changed one way or the other. So this isn't a political map. This is just showing demographic change. And I'll hand it over to you, Professor Cox.
No, and I think it goes back to too. You talked about the shifts that have been happening over the last 20 years. I mean, as population shifts happen, the parties are going to have to shift as well to meet those demographic shifts. So I think that, when you look at, how many youth does Texas have? What is the minority versus, Hispanic, African American, white? What do those numbers look like? What is the education, and right now it was interesting looking at even the Beto O'Rourke Cruz election from 2016 that was so close. There are 9 areas around North Dallas, up in the Collin County, Denton.
I think you're cutting out a little bit. I don't know if that's.
Oh, can you hear me okay? Can you hear me okay now?
Yeah, I can hear fine.
Oh, sorry. Okay. But there were 9 areas in the north part of Dallas, or that area where Beto O'Rourke won. And so the Democratic Party has been looking at that particular area, and what they were looking at is college educated white voters. So then there was the 9 points to 2.5 change between Trump and Cruz had a lot more to do with this group, is what they're seeing. And so you see not just in demographic shifts, but how people are voting is changing. And I think that has to do with, in 20 years, things change. I think that the parties are going to have to reevaluate that.
Another interesting thing about the Beto election too was those people that are moving from California, New York, and Jersey, they actually were more likely to vote for Ted Cruz than they were for Beto, and it was native Texans voting for Beto.
Huh.
Yeah.
So I think what that means is we think generally like, oh, all these Californians are coming, Texas is going to turn blue, but maybe the Californians that are coming to Texas are coming here because it's not blue.
Yeah. And I mean, looking at the electorate, the people who are voting on a regular basis is still 55% white. Latinos only make up about a quarter of the voters. And the reason digging into that is, there's a lot of young Latino voters who don't vote. There's whether they're able to vote, if they're citizens yet or not. And so they're looking at a lot of that data. But what they found is about 1/3 of the Latinos that do vote actually do vote Republican. So still, I think when we look at these numbers, Texas is still one of 3 states that will be over 50% minority. The other two are California, Hawaii, if you're curious. But we're one of the biggest majority states, but a lot of the minority groups, especially when you look at Latino and Latina, are really young. And so I think both of the parties, knowing that you do have about 1/3 of that group go Republican, both of the parties are looking at how do we turn out the Latina vote.
Well, and I think it's so interesting. You brought up Beto. To me, that was like such a marketing thing. Beto O'Rourke. So to me, that was a for sure way of going, oh, hey, I'm Hispanic, vote for me. And I think it's interesting. We could do a whole nother series on the marketing of political candidates. When I did my vote, there is a candidate running for something, and I can't remember off the top of my head, but it was a very, very well-known name. And I think a lot of people would just pick that name because they know it, even though it's not the same person. And I wish I remember what it was. It might have been George Bush, but it wasn't the real George Bush. It was someone else. So the marketing of these candidates, I believe, is just. I think that's another fascinating topic that we could talk about. But the next,
and that goes all the way back. There was a campaign in the 1960s for Kennedy, the Viva Kennedy campaign, because Kennedy was Catholic, and a lot of the Hispanic voters in Texas were Catholic, and nobody had ever reached out to them before.
In that way.
Yeah, and that's oh, sorry. And that's what we're seeing now.
That there's common interests.
Yeah, that's what we're seeing now is that a lot of the, if you look at some of the statistics on Latino voting is that they're not groups that have been courted very often. And I think youth vote as well. And so you have some of these campaigns really targeting, youth vote and minority vote and trying to get them to change their minds. Because again, youth vote, when you look at just that one, they typically don't vote. So, how you get them out to vote, it becomes a big question. We actually, today there was an article, I can't remember which paper, but one of the sites on youth voting, that youth voting in Texas is up quite a bit. We're actually leading the nation in youth voting right now in this current election cycle. So there is a shift in youth voting, and I think that's something to take into consideration as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. So that brings me to the question, what's new in this election cycle?
So what is new? Recent polls, you got to look at those again. There's a question about, are we underestimating either the parties? Historically, Democrats in Texas are underestimated by 2 to 3 points. So if we see a tight race with only 2 points separating candidates, and they're underestimating the Democratic performance, that could swing Texas more towards the purple blue, if that makes sense. And I think no matter what, the results are going to be close in a lot of these races that are competitive. So Congress, if we look at just Congress, we talked about John Cornyn a little bit already, but He is favored to win. I think that he is working a little harder than he's had to in previous years. He's having to spend more money. He's having to get there and campaign. But one thing I noticed is watching the debate. It was on a Friday night. And I don't think a lot of people watched it, between Hager and Cornyn. Is Hager's new, and you could tell that she was new and campaigning. But Cornyn was using the older Republican playbook, which basically just fell back on she's too liberal for Texas. But he didn't go into a whole lot of detail. And I think that that was a indication that in that race, I think Cornyn will win, but the numbers are tightening up. Maybe his name recognition, he doesn't have a strong name recognition like, say, Ted Cruz does. But I still think he'll win. As far as the House, Texas does have some movement there. About 12 seats right now are a question mark, and that's in comparison to, if we go back even to 2012, there were 34 safe Republican seats. Right now, there are 12 that are question marks. And I'll give you one example. Or two examples. Wendy Davis, which Misty mentioned, is one that they're trying to turn blue. And then the other one is Representative Pete Olson. He announced he's retiring. He's not seeking re-election. It's Tom DeLay. If anybody knows Tom DeLay, it's his old seat. And Olson beat Siri Kulkarni, and I apologize if I mispronounced her name, in 2018. But she's running a really, really tight race against Republican Troy Nehls and spending a ton of money. And that one they're thinking may flip. It's a Sugar Land area, Houston area, which is seeing tremendous numbers in voter turnout. In the House, what we're seeing, all 150 seats are up for re-election in the Texas House. The Texas Republicans have held that House since 2001. And so that's going to be a big deal looking at those seats because, number one, if you know anything in Texas government, Bonin, who's the current Speaker of the House, is not running again. We have the census, so we'll have redistricting. So there's a lot of things at play. And in the 2018 election, Democrats did flip 11 seats. They need 9 to take the House. And right now, I believe the Texas House is leaning Democrat. The Texas Senate is not. Texas Senate is leaning Republican. And I believe there's only one real seat that possibly is even up for grabs on the Senate side. But anyway, that was an interesting seat. It's Representative Peter Flores. He's down. That seat is the one that I think might flip. It's down in the border. We're talking about border area, right along Coahuila. This district that he's in includes San Antonio. And his challenger, Roland Gutierrez, was formerly in the Texas House for 6 terms. Democrats actually held this seat. It's in Republican control right now, but Democrats held it for 139 years. But in 2018, Carlos Uresti, who had the seat, had to step down because he was sentenced to 12 years in prison for fraud and bribery. So this seat's going to be a fun one to watch. I think that's the one Senate seat that might go back to the Democrats if there's a chance at all. And lastly, the statewide races. You have Railroad Commission seats, 4 Supreme Court seats, 3 Court of Criminal Appeals seats, 8 State Board of Education, and more. And the one I want to mention is the Railroad Commission today, or I guess Monday actually. The Bloomberg group that's been throwing a bunch of money at stuff gave the Democratic candidate Krista Castett at $2.6 million, which is unreal. So wow. I still think all the statewide races are going to go Republican, though. Anything below the House and the Senate.
So what is new in voter registration? I see these Texas registered voter number goes up. Explain this to us.
So this is what I think is really, really exciting. We are seeing a massive jump in people wanting to participate, and registering to vote is the first step for that. So once you get registered, then you of course have to actually go to the polls. So this is step 1 of step 2. But I want you guys to look at the Tarrant County number. For us to have an 82% registered voter rate, that's amazing. That's showing that we're getting more people involved. That's showing that people are paying attention, they're caring. That's huge. We tend to, in Texas, govern by apathy. We just don't go vote, so it must be okay. Things are fine. This is showing us that people are starting to tune into issues and pay attention.
Yeah, and I think another thing that people feel, especially, I mean, I think people of all ages feel like my vote, one person's not going to make a difference. And Misty and I have done a webinar with Allegra last year on all of the different times that one vote did make a difference. So if that's the way you feel, like it doesn't matter, what can I do? That is not true, and every single vote counts.
I just put in the chat, it's You Won't Vote by Johnny Harris. It was put out this morning, and he is 32 years old. He worked for Vox and all that, so he is in that target range. He's talking on a national level, but he kind of goes through why he thinks youth don't vote, and he includes himself in those categories or those age brackets. But at the end, he says the exact same thing, which I thought was really interesting, that even if your person does not win, no matter which party that you're with, the person who does takes into account how many people voted against them in making their decisions. As it gets close, they have to be more compromising with that other party, if that makes sense. And so I think that just because your person doesn't win doesn't mean your vote doesn't count. You can influence policy and legislation just as much.
That's a great point. And you know what I like about that is that he's in his mid 30s and he considers himself part of the youth. So
I know. Well, his cutoff was right at 34, so he's right at the.
Wow.
I'll notice his video because I'm getting old.
I love that. Okay, so what are some sources that our students might find useful going into this election?
So the big one for me is the wait times, because we have had some crazy wait times, which is amazing. It's awesome that we want people to vote. That's awesome. But I don't want to wait 4 hours to vote.
Right.
So use this link here, and that will give you a live view of how long each precinct's line is for early voting. So my husband and I, we got on there, we looked at it, and it just turns out the one that was closest to us had a 0 to 20 minute wait. We were in and out, car, voting, back to car in 9 minutes.
And I would like to point out, my daughter voted at the downtown Trinity River campus. Same thing. She said there was 0 wait. She walked up, voted, and was gone. So.
Yeah, I used the same site. It took me 15 minutes as well. I went to the old UNT campus down off Montgomery. You know, it was easy. The second one is the Ballot Ready site. I found this one. It's a newer site, but students always ask, I wish there was a site I could go to check if I'm registered, find out where my polling location is, who's on my ballot, all in one place, and it walked me through it. Guess what? This site does it. You literally go put in your address and it walks you through all that. It is awesome.
All right, cool. So we've got all of these great things that our students can just click on this link. And let me ask you, once our video is on YouTube, will these links still be live?
They won't, but I can put them in the video description, so you'll still get them. Before we move on, I do want to say, if you're watching polls, if you like to watch polls, if you're that person, I am, 538 is generally where I go, just because they're easy to read. And I think you can get the big idea without getting too bogged down. If you like to get bogged down, Pew Research is great, but most people want to go to 538. And then Kim, can you talk about the Choose Your Judges? Because I think this is really cool.
For the longest time, and I'll be honest, even though I love this stuff, judges have been the hardest to research. And so Choose Your Judges is a brand new site. You go in and it gives you a little quiz on things that judges will be looking at, criminal law type questions, et cetera. I think it's 10 questions. I can't remember. I just did it, but it was like 10, 12 questions. It's really short. And then you put in also your information, your vote, like where you live, and it pulls up the judges for you that are going to be on your ballot. Now, when I pulled it up, I answered the question, said this is probably the better choice for you. But what I liked is it gave me both people, so I could go look at both people. So basically, the 9 judges or so that were on my ballot, after I answered those questions, just came up. It told me where, based on my questions, I probably would want to vote, but it also gave me the other person's information. And I love that. That's the first time I've seen that as a standalone judge source online.
This is all really, really good information. So are we going to, do we feel confident enough to say what we think is going to happen?
I guess sort of. No, I think that I do in some ways. And I based my percent of eligible voters. Remember I said it was 58, 59, 58, 59 in the last few elections. So mine's pretty close to what I'm going to say 59% at least. It could go higher because our voter turnout's really high. But I'm going to stick at that 59%. On Trump versus Biden, I do think Trump will take Texas. I think it'll be a really close race though. So those numbers could change, but oh gosh, I still think Trump will win Texas electoral college votes. I also think that Cornyn will win the Texas U.S. Senate seat. I'm going to guess on these other ones. I think Texas will flip the House, or will take the House. The Democrats will take the House. I think they'll flip enough seats. 6 to 9 is where I'm going to guess. I've kind of changed a little bit, and I think on the Senate side, I think Democrats will only flip 1 seat, and I think the Texas Senate will stay in Republican control. So we may have the House under the Democratic side in Texas and the Senate under the Republican side is my best guess. And in 2040, what will the political color of Texas be? I'm going to go purple. I still think, I know a lot of people are saying that we're turning blue, but I think that there are a lot of Republicans. We've been a conservative state for a long time. I think the people that move here typically are conservative, but I don't think it'll be a slam dunk anymore. I think you'll see splits. I think blue in urban counties, with East Texas, the Panhandle, and West Texas staying red for a while. But I think it'll be a more even battle. I don't think for the next few cycles at minimum, our party will just be able to sit back on their laurels and go, I got this. I don't need to work. That's my guess.
Okay, so for me, we're actually not too far off here.
Nah.
Yep, I think that we're going to have right at 50% of eligible voters. I am predicting a Trump victory and a Cornyn victory. I think that we're going to have 4 to 5 seats flip, and I think we're going to be on the red side of purple. So I'm going to call that maroon.
So Legger couldn't be here today, but these were her predictions. So she thinks 52% of the people will turn out to vote. Also predicting Trump and Cornyn going to win, a 5 change in the Texas House. And she said statewide blue, but with very red counties. And then I'm going to say 55% of the people are going to vote. I think we're going to have some people vote 30 or independent. So mine don't add up to 100. It's not that I'm bad at math. It's that I was making a calculation. But I do think our electoral votes will go to Trump. I think Cornyn is going to win in the Senate. I think maybe we'll see 5 seats flip. And then I think if you look at us overall statewide, I think we will be purple. But I think when you zoom in, it's going to be like an impressionist painting. The dots are going to be very, very strongly colored blue or red, but then when you back out, the whole thing will look purple.
Okay, cool. And I'm just going to say this because I'm getting a lot of things in the chat. Misty has posted the link. If you cannot see the link, then you need to email one of us, Misty Wilson, Thurman, or Kimberly Cox, and we will send you the link. And the link that I'm referring to is for attendance. All right. So.
And I also put a link in there into our YouTube channel because somebody asked for that.
Okay, awesome.
So there's 2 different links.
All right, perfect. The top link is attendance. The bottom link is, well, now we've got credit. All right, so yeah.
I put it in again.
So just email us. All right, so Are you registered? Is it too late if I'm not?
It is, but
It's too
still
late.
do it so you can vote next time.
Dang it. I already voted.
Me too.
So we're good. Perfect. All right. Any parting words?
So go vote, please.
Yeah, go vote.
We don't really
Go
care who
vote.
you vote for, but we
Yeah.
do care that you vote. We have one more webinar we're going to do. And so when we come back on the 17th, we're going to get to see which of us was most correct.
Good luck to us all.
Right. That sounds awesome.
And you guys, when you fill out that link for attendance, if there's a topic you want us to tackle in the spring, let us know. We are starting to work on that. And we have a few ideas that we've picked up from other places, but we want to do something that you guys are interested in.
All right. That sounds great. Well, thank you very much to both of my presenters. I think this was interesting and I learned something today. So thank you very much.
Thanks. Y'all have a good
Thank you guys. Have a great day.
Bye.